Okay, but you're still saying these kids should, like, not be accepted because they don't really fit in either place? They can't just, like...
I'm saying that the Boy Scouts have a standard. You must be a biological boy to be a Boy Scout. You have to be a boy to be a Boy Scout.
Where's that written, though? Okay.
In the name Boy Scouts.
This is Ben Shapiro, giving his thoughts on transgenderism and whether or not transgender people should be accepted into communities which are based on gender. Most fans of Ben Shapiro would say that this clip is him at his best, completely and utterly destroying the left with facts and logic. You can find conservatives around the globe voicing their sympathy for the woman Ben is speaking to here, because she should be just that embarrassed at having been beaten so badly.
In the name Boy Scouts.
It is the common belief that this clip, and the discussion it is from, is some of the strongest evidence there is that Ben Shapiro is an amazing debater and an extremely intelligent person. Now, obviously, I am far from the first person to argue that Ben Shapiro is a fool, or that he is in fact terrible at debate. However, most people who do end up drawing this conclusion do so based on the fact that Ben rarely picks a battle with someone who is as experienced as he is. And when he does, he usually ends up getting, well, for lack of a better word, destroyed.
I'm not inclined to continue an interview with a person as badly motivated as you as an interviewer, so I think we're done here. I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much.
However, I do not believe cherry-picking examples of Ben Shapiro at his worst is the most accurate method of measuring just how bad at debate this man actually is. No, I believe the best way to evaluate Ben Shapiro and his skill in debate is to do so on his terms. If we are to destroy Ben Shapiro in such a way that even his own fans will understand, we need to attack the strongest version of him. After all, if Ben Shapiro at his best is still just an arrogant moron, then it should be an easy conclusion to reach that he was just never that good in the first place. So, in order to destroy Ben Shapiro at his own game, let us begin with the context behind the clip I just showed you.
In the name Boy Scouts.
Earlier in this discussion, Shapiro's opponent made the argument that sex and gender are not interchangeable, that one is separate from the other.
Biological, but gender is a completely different thing.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex, so.
It's not completely disconnected, but it's still a cultural thing, it's still from society, it's
Okay, no, it is not in the mind, okay? You're not a man if you think you're a man.
You'll notice that Ben immediately shut this point down with a simple no it's not. Now, I could sit here and share with you the overwhelming evidence, psychological, neuroscientific, and even biological, against Ben Shapiro's immediate response and in support of the legitimacy of transgender people and their identities, but the simple truth of the matter is, none of that matters. What matters is that Ben's opponent brought up a point that Ben personally was not comfortable with, and so he elected to simply avoid it, and change the subject to why he should not even have to tolerate that position in the first place.
But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
This, however, presents a big problem. If Ben outright refuses to engage his opponent on equal terms, if Ben refuses to even consider his opponent's perspective on something as crucial as the meaning of a word, then suddenly this is not a debate anymore. No debate can even take place because both parties are now speaking two different languages. If Ben is not willing to acknowledge his opponent's definition of the word gender, even just for the sake of argument, then Ben is intentionally creating a misunderstanding just so he can avoid making a counter-argument.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex. So, no, it is not in the mind, okay? You're not a man if you think you're a man.
One side effect of this is the following exchange.
I'm saying that the Boy Scouts have a standard. You must be a biological boy to be a Boy Scout. You have to be a boy to be a Boy Scout.
Where's that written, though? Okay.
In the name Boy Scouts.
The reason Ben was able to respond to "where is that written" with
"in the name Boy Scouts"
is because earlier in this discussion, Ben desperately avoided acknowledging the argument that gender and sex are separate entities. However, as I am sure you all know, sidestepping an argument does not magically mean the argument was never made. The fact of the matter is that Shapiro's opponent already made the distinction between sex and gender, which already, by itself, invalidates Ben's response of
"in the name Boy Scouts."
The fact that this response even happened proves, right then and there, that Ben is actively ignoring his opponent's arguments and is instead focusing on constructing a narrative for himself, as well as people who already agree with him. This is not how debate works. This is the equivalent of winning an imaginary argument while you're taking a shower. This line may sound really cool in isolation, but the fact that Ben ignored his opponent's entire argument in order to deliver it is not only poor sportsmanship, but a giant logical fallacy that Ben here is wearing like some sort of badge of honor.
In the name Boy Scouts.
Oh my God, shut up!
But wait, there's more. What if I told you that this logic, this same logic that we just used to disprove and debunk one of Ben Shapiro's supposedly best arguments, this exact same logic can be scaled up and applied to literally all of Ben's arguments over the course of this discussion? Case in point, observe.
Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60? Why can't you identify as 60? You can't magically change your gender. You can't magically change your sex. You can't magically change your age.
Magic has nothing to do with it, Mr. Shapiro, because your opponent has already defined gender as being separate from sex. A definition that you, again, chose to reject and ignore rather than dispute and argue with.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex, so.
Now, before we continue our review of Ben Shapiro's debate skills, I'm going to borrow a quote from Potholer54 in order to explain exactly what is happening here, and in all likelihood why Ben Shapiro is so hung up on this.
Whenever someone takes a scientific fact and calls it magic, what he usually means is he doesn't understand how it works.
You can't magically change your gender.
It's quite obvious that Ben Shapiro is uneducated on this particular subject, which is why he keeps insisting that transgender people need magic in order to exist, when in reality, he simply doesn't understand and certainly doesn't want to admit his own ignorance. Of course, Ben Shapiro can easily rectify this ignorance by taking the time to learn and understand the terms he's discussing, but whenever someone tries to bring this up to him, he either A, turns their mic off and talks over them, or B, uses any number of logical fallacies to get away from that particular subject as quickly as possible.
I don't need a 7-year degree in sociology to know bullshit when I hear it.
Case in point, Ben's opponents went out of her way to explain the difference between sex and gender at the beginning of this discussion. But again, rather than dispute this claim and make an argument, Ben instead opted to ignore it and continue with the argument he wanted to make instead. An argument that, coincidentally, falls apart when you even begin to consider the opening statement that Ben Shapiro is trying so desperately to avoid acknowledging. So once again, while Ben Shapiro's epic get-wrecked libtard line may sound really good in isolation, he still needed to ignore literally everything his opponent has set up to this point in order to deliver it. Therefore, obviously, he is the clear loser of this debate, because he is not participating in the debate.
Why aren't you 60? Why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
Because it's not the same as gender. You can't just...
You're right, age is significantly less important than gender.
What's interesting about this clip is that Ben's opponents actually tried to point out the obvious false equivalence Ben is employing, which would have inevitably led back to what she said literally 2 minutes ago about sex and gender being separate entities. However, Ben realized this and, again, rejected the entire point because literally anything that could possibly lead back to the original claim that sex and gender are separate entities would have unraveled everything Ben has argued thus far. Even more interesting, however, is that in response to being called out for employing a fallacy, Ben Shapiro employed another fallacy, deflecting the entire point and desperately trying to derail the Socratic method that was very quickly closing in on him.
You're right, age is significantly less important than gender.
I would like to take a moment to remind everyone that this example is supposed to be Ben Shapiro at his absolute best. However, in these few minutes alone, I have exposed not one, not two, but 3 logical and argumentative fallacies that Ben Shapiro has employed over the course of this discussion. And it's not like these are small fallacies either. They are literally the foundation of Ben's entire argument. If even one of these fallacies were never used, Ben's entire argument would unravel because the conversation would inevitably be steered back to his opponent's opening statement, which cannot coexist with literally everything Ben has said up to this point. Because once everyone's attention is brought back to the fact that Ben's opponent has already made the distinction between sex and gender, Ben instantly loses because he's been using them interchangeably this entire time. And his argument simply cannot stand if they are not used interchangeably.
Why aren't you 60?
And even if we were to assume that Ben is actually arguing that they should be used interchangeably, which would explain why he keeps doing so to serve his logic, that only means that his "why aren't you 60" argument is not only a false equivalence fallacy, but is also circular reasoning, because the only way for it to come even close to working is if the conclusion of Ben's argument is already assumed to be correct.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex. So, why aren't you 60?
That, ladies, gentlemen, and all in between, is the textbook definition of circular reasoning. And it is the most easily spotted and easily avoidable fallacy in the book.
And it all boils down to circular reasoning.
It is about as unreasonable and, above all else, illogical as it can possibly get. It is also the center of Ben Shapiro's entire argument. That makes it 4 logical fallacies that Ben Shapiro has employed over the course of 3 minutes. 4 in the last 3 minutes. That's gotta be some kind of record. How is someone capable of being this bad at debating, of being this stupid, and still having millions of people treating him like some sort of genius? This man is an idiot.
Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60? Why can't you identify as 60?
Oh geez, Ben, I don't know. Maybe it's because the laws of time and space and the studies of biology and psychology are not in any way the same thing, you stupid, stupid man.
You're right, age is significantly less important than gender.
You're a stupid man! A stupid, stupid man!
Let's recap. Ben's opponent explained the difference between sex and gender, and Ben ignored and rejected this point, moving on with his argument. Deflection. Ben then compared gender to age in order to ask the rhetorical question of,
why aren't you 60?
And use that to say that your gender cannot be changed, which is not only a false equivalence, but requires circular reasoning to even work because it doesn't make any sense unless Ben is already assuming that sex and gender mean the same thing. Ben then used these 2 fallacies as a jumping off point to equate being transgender to magic, which already fails because, again, it relies on gender and sex already meaning the same thing and is therefore circular reasoning on Ben's part.
And it all boils down to circular reasoning.
But my dear viewer, do you want to know the best part about all of this? If, at the beginning of this discussion, Ben Shapiro had not outright refused to acknowledge his opponent's definition of the word gender, he likely would not have even needed to rely on these logical fallacies in order to protect his argument. Ben Shapiro, the man who is supposed to be an amazing debater, could have avoided all of these errors if he had not outright skipped the most important part of any debate. The part where both parties take the time to understand each other. Also, you know, the part where you don't rely on 4 logical fallacies and not even as many minutes to get your fundamentally stupid point across. You know, if Ben had followed that rule as well, he would have a much stronger case for being a good debater, rather than being literally the dumbest person alive that millions of people still somehow have faith in.
In the name Boy Scouts.
It's amazing how every time you open your mouth, you prove you're an idiot.